They laughed when the old veteran was handed a broken-down storage chest from his sister's estate, until his yellow Labrador wouldn't stop scratching at the bottom of it. And what she found inside turned out to be worth $220 million. When Frank Decker arrived at his sister's house in Barrie, Ontario for the reading of her will, he drove up alone in a faded blue Ford pickup that had seen too many winters. He parked at the far end of the driveway, away from the polished SUVs that belonged to his nephew and niece. He wore the same jacket he always wore, dark green, slightly frayed at the cuffs, Canadian Forces logo barely visible on the shoulder. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Maple, his yellow Labrador, who pressed her nose against the window and watched the house carefully. Frank hadn't spoken to his sister Elaine in almost 4 years before she died, not because of any argument, just because life had a way of growing distance between people who were once close, and neither of them had ever been very good at closing it. But Elaine used to call him on Remembrance Day every single year, without fail. Even when she was sick, she'd say the same thing every time. "I still think about what you went through over there, Frank. You never talk about it enough." He never did. That wasn't the kind of man Frank Decker was. He was 67 years old. He had served in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry for 22 years, including 2 tours in Bosnia and 1 in Afghanistan. He came home from Kandahar with a knee that never healed right and a silence that had moved in like a permanent lodger and never quite left. He had been married once to a woman named Patricia, who had tried her best to understand him, but couldn't live in that silence forever. They had a son together, Thomas, who lived out in Calgary now with his own family and called on birthdays and Christmas. Life was quiet. Frank had made his peace with quiet. He rented a small house near Collingwood, on the edge of Georgian Bay, where the winters were long and the summers were brief and beautiful. He did odd jobs around the community, fixing fences, splitting firewood for older neighbors, helping at the food bank on Friday mornings. Maple went everywhere with him. She had been trained as a therapy dog through a veterans program, and even though she was officially retired now, she never fully switched off. She still read a room before Frank did. Still knew when something was wrong, before he could name it himself. Frank pushed open the door of Elaine's house and stepped inside. His nephew Derek was already holding court near the dining room table. 41 years old, a real estate developer out of Toronto, suit that probably cost more than Frank's truck. He was talking in the confident, slightly too loud way of someone who had already decided how things were going to go. And his niece Sandra stood near the kitchen counter, with her arms folded, adding the occasional sharp word to whatever Derek was saying. She was a lawyer, which Frank had always thought suited her personality well. They both turned when Frank came through the door, the kind of turning that was just a little too slow. Just deliberate enough to register that they had noticed him and weren't particularly moved by the fact. "Derek, Sandra." He nodded. Derek gave a tight smile. "Uncle Frank, glad you could make it up from Collingwood, right? Still up there? Still up there." Maple padded in beside him and sat down without being asked. Sandra glanced at the dog briefly. She didn't say anything. The family lawyer was a man named Mr. Okafor, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, who had clearly done this many times before and understood that will readings were almost never peaceful. He set his briefcase on the dining table and removed several documents. "Elaine Decker's estate," he began, "includes the property here in Barrie, a cabin near Huntsville, 2 investment accounts, and several items of personal property." Derek had already leaned forward slightly in his chair. Sandra had uncrossed her arms. To Derek Holt, Mr. Okafor continued, "She leaves the Barrie property and the primary investment account. To Sandra Holt, she leaves the Huntsville cabin and the secondary investment account." Both of them exhaled in a way that people try to make quiet, but never quite manage. Mr. Okafor turned another page. To her brother Frank Decker, she leaves the Cedar storage chest currently in the basement along with its contents. The room went still for exactly 2 seconds. Then Derek made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like a breath that escaped before he could stop it. A cedar chest? Sandra looked up from the table. That old thing? Derek leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. He glanced at Frank with the expression of a man who had already won everything and could now afford to be mildly amused. Well, I suppose that's appropriate. Frank held his eyes for a moment, then looked away. The cedar chest had been in the basement since Frank could remember. Elaine had always called it the grandmother's trunk. It had come down through the family from their mother's side, and it smelled of old cedar and something else. Camphor, maybe, or just time. Nobody had ever paid much attention to it. It sat in the corner of the basement like a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness but hadn't yet been thrown out. Frank went downstairs alone to look at it. Maple followed him. The chest was about 4 feet long and 2 feet deep, dark cedar, brass fittings along the edges that had gone green with age. The lid was heavy. Frank opened it slowly. Inside, old quilts, folded carefully. A few bundles of letters tied with ribbon. A tin box that had once held biscuits. Nothing special, nothing that looked like much of anything. Frank reached in and moved one of the quilts aside. Maple had come up beside him and was sniffing the chest carefully along the bottom edge. She made a soft sound. Not a bark, just a quiet exhale through her nose, and pressed her paw against the floor of the chest. Frank looked at her. What's that? Maple pressed again. Her tail was slow and focused, not excited, not playful. The way she moved when she was working. Frank knocked gently on the bottom panel. The sound came back solid, but not entirely right. He knocked again, shifting slightly to the left. Different. Lighter. He knelt down and ran his fingers at Isenisen where the floor of the chest met the sides. Most of it was flush, seamless. But near the far left corner, barely visible under the edge of a brass fitting, there was a gap. A thin line of shadow where there shouldn't have been one. Frank sat back on his heels and looked at Maple. She looked back at him steadily. He went upstairs and came back with a flathead screwdriver. He worked the blade gently into the gap. The panel resisted, then slowly it lifted. Beneath it was a false floor, maybe 2 inches deep, running the entire width of the chest. And inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth and packed tightly side by side, were bundles, dozens of them, wrapped in waxed canvas and tied with cotton string. Frank picked one up, heavy. He untied the string and unwrapped the cloth. United States $100 bills, crisp, dense, stacked so tightly they barely gave when he pressed his thumb against them. He set it down on the floor, picked up another, same. He picked up 4 more, all the same. He sat on the concrete floor of Elaine's basement with 6 bundles of cash in front of him, and the cedar chest open beside him. And for a long moment he did not move. Maple came and sat beside him. She pressed her shoulder against his arm the way she always did when she could feel him going somewhere difficult in his head. He stayed there a while, just breathing. Upstairs, Derek was on the phone, probably already calling someone about property assessments. Sandra was talking to Mr. Okafor. Nobody came downstairs. Frank refolded the oilcloth carefully over each bundle and placed them back exactly as he had found them. He lowered the false floor back into place. The brass fitting settled over the corner gap. He closed the lid of the chest. Then he sat down on the bottom step of the stairs and looked at Maple. She wagged her tail once. He drove home to Collingwood that night, with the chest in the truck bed, covered with a tarp. Maple sat upright the whole drive, watching the dark highway. The Georgian Bay stretch of the 26 was empty at that hour. Stars were out, sharp and cold the way they get in November over the bay. Frank didn't sleep much that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and thought about Elaine. About her voice on the phone every November 11th. About the fact that she had left everything of clear visible value to Derek and Sandra, and had quietly left him this. She had done it on purpose. He knew that without needing a letter to tell him, but the next morning, when he opened the chest again on the kitchen floor and began carefully removing the bundles and counting, he began to understand the scale of what she had done. Each bundle contained $10,000. He counted the bundles in the false floor, 31. Then he measured the space more carefully. The floor of the chest was 47 inches wide, by 23 inches deep. The bundles were packed in 4 rows. He had only seen the first layer. He pressed his fingers along the sides of the false floor and felt it. Another gap. Another panel below. A second false floor. He lifted it carefully. More oilcloth, more bundles. He spread everything out across the kitchen floor and counted for 2 hours. Maple lay on her bed in the corner and watched him, chin resting on her paws. When he was done, he sat back against the kitchen counter and stared at the number he had written on the notepad in front of him. $220 million. He looked at Maple. She lifted her head. That's... He stopped. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, quietly, Elaine. He made himself a second cup of tea. He sat at the table. He did not touch the money again that day. He thought about where it had come from. Elaine had run a small logistics company for 30 years, working contracts between Ontario suppliers and distributors across the Great Lakes region. Nothing flashy. She lived modestly, drove a sensible car, kept the same house for decades. But the company had grown quietly, steadily, and she had sold it 7 years earlier for a number she never discussed with anyone, including Frank. He thought about what kind of person hides $220 million in a cedar chest in the basement. And then he thought about what kind of person leaves it to the brother nobody at the will reading had bothered to look at twice. That evening he found what he was looking for. Tucked inside the tin biscuit box, beneath a folded piece of red felt, was an envelope. His name was written on it in Elaine's handwriting. Just Frank. The same way she had signed every letter she ever sent him overseas. No dear, no formality, just his name like she was handing it to him directly. He opened it at the kitchen table, with Maple beside his chair. The letter was 2 pages written in Elaine's small, careful hand. Frank, she began. If you're reading this, then Mr. Okafor did his job and you took the chest home. I knew you would. You were always the one who kept things other people threw away. He read slowly. I sold the company for considerably more than people knew. I invested carefully over the years after that. I watched the money grow in ways that never felt entirely real to me. I've always been better with crates and contracts than with capital gains. But the amount in that chest is what I kept aside. Not in accounts. Not on paper. Because I know what happens when money becomes something the wrong people can see. He turned the page. Derek and Sandra are not bad people, Frank. But they would have divided this like territory. They would have spent it proving something to each other and to the world. I didn't want that for it. I wanted it to go to someone who would be quiet about it long enough to think. His throat tightened. You've been quiet your whole life. Sometimes too quiet. But in this case, I think that's exactly right. He had to stop reading for a moment. She went on. You served this country for 22 years and came home, and never asked for anything. I know what it cost you. I know you won't talk about it. You never did. But I watched what you did with your retirement, Frank. The food bank, the firewood, for old Mr. Callahan, the way you drove 4 hours to sit with Dave Perkins when his wife died. You think nobody notices. I noticed. Use this as you see fit. The only thing I ask is that you don't be small about it. The letter ended there. No signature. Just, I love you, E. Frank folded the pages carefully and put them back in the envelope. He held it in both hands for a while without moving. Maple put her head on his knee. He sat there in the kitchen of his rented house on the edge of Georgian Bay, with $220 million spread across the floor in bundles of waxed canvas, and he thought about what it meant to not be small. He didn't move quickly. That wasn't his way. He found a lawyer in Toronto, not anyone connected to the family, and disclosed everything properly. He paid what was owed to the government. He set up a foundation. He gave himself 3 months before he made any significant decisions. In that time, Derek called once. It was a brief conversation. I heard you found something in that old chest, Derek said. His voice had a particular quality to it. The kind of carefully measured casualness that means the opposite of casual. Frank said, I found what Elaine left me. A pause. Derek said, well, if there's anything in there that might be considered part of the broader estate. Elaine left me the chest and its contents, Frank said. Mr. Okafor can confirm. There was a longer pause. Frank could hear Derek choosing his next words. Look, Uncle Frank, I don't want this to become something adversarial. I just think, given the scale. Frank said, Derek, I don't have a lot of years left to spend on conversations like this one. So I'll be direct with you. What Elaine left me is mine. Legally and in every other sense. If you'd like to pursue it, that's your right. But I'd encourage you to speak to your own lawyer first. He said goodbye and hung up. Derek did pursue it. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later, claiming that any undisclosed assets hidden within estate property constituted funds that should be distributed equitably among surviving family members. It was a creative argument. Frank's lawyer, a methodical woman named Christine Park, was ready for it. The hearing was in Toronto in February. Frank drove down the night before and stayed in a hotel near Union Station. He brought Maple. The front desk pretended not to notice. The courtroom was on the 8th floor of a gray building that smelled of carpet and recycled air. Derek sat with his lawyers across the aisle, in a suit that was even more expensive than the one from Barrie. Sandra was with him. She looked less certain than Derek did. Christine Park presented the will clearly. She presented Mr. Okafor's testimony. She presented the letter, which, she noted, demonstrated Elaine Decker's unambiguous intent. And she presented the simple fact that the chest, as personal property explicitly named in the will, transferred fully to Frank Decker, including any and all contents, disclosed or otherwise. Derek's lawyer argued that the funds represented a concealment of estate assets. The judge, a quiet woman with reading glasses on a chain, listened to everything carefully. Then she asked one question. She looked at Derek's lawyer. Can you demonstrate that Elaine Decker intended these funds to be part of the general estate rather than a personal bequest? The lawyer began a careful response about the nature of estate property and disclosure obligations. The judge waited. Then she said, simply, the will is unambiguous. The chest and its contents belong to the named beneficiary. Dismissed. Derek stared at the table for a moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without looking at Frank. Sandra paused at the door. For a second, something crossed her face. Not apology exactly, but something close to it. Then she followed her brother out. Christine Park gathered her files quietly. Frank sat for another minute, hands resting on his knees the way he used to sit after long patrols when his body was asking for stillness. Outside the courthouse, Maple was waiting in the cab of the truck with the window cracked. She stood up when she saw Frank come through the glass doors. Her tail moved in slow, steady arcs. He opened the door and she stepped down beside him. The February air off the lake was sharp and clean. He stood on the steps and breathed it in. He thought about what came next. The foundation had already been registered. He had chosen the name carefully, turning it over for weeks before it settled. The Maple Ridge Veterans Foundation, named not after the city, but after the dog. He had spoken to veterans organizations across Ontario and British Columbia and Nova Scotia. He had visited 3 existing support centers and talked to the people who ran them and the people who used them. He had sat in plain rooms drinking bad coffee with men and women who had come home from places that didn't let them go easily. And he had listened more than he had spoken, because that was the part he knew how to do. The first facility opened that September, outside of Kingston, on a property with old maple trees and a pond that caught the morning light. It offered housing, counseling, and a working dog program that trained and paired service animals with veterans who needed them. The dogs came from shelters and from breeders who donated litters. They were trained on the property by people who understood both dogs and soldiers. Frank went to Kingston for the opening. He stood near the edge of the property while people gathered near the main building, and he watched a man about 35 years old kneel down in the gravel to meet a yellow Labrador puppy for the first time. The puppy licked his face. The man laughed, the kind of laugh that surprises the person it comes from, because it arrives before they've had a chance to decide whether they're ready to laugh. Frank had not heard a sound like that in a long time. He stood very still and let it land. Maple stood beside him, older now, a little slower on the stairs, hers all gone almost entirely white. But her eyes were steady and her posture was the same. Quiet, watchful, present. Frank rested his hand on her head. He thought about Elaine writing that letter in her careful small handwriting. About the cedar chest sitting in a basement for 40 years while the family walked past it. About Maple pressing her paw against the false floor in the dark of that November afternoon. Not making a fuss about it, just letting him know something was there. He thought about all the things that sit unnoticed until the right person comes along and pays attention. He looked out at the property, the maple trees catching the September sun, the pond at the far end reflecting a sky that was going orange and gold at the edges, and he thought that Elaine would have liked this. "You're not being small about it," she would have said. She would have handed him a bad cup of tea and looked satisfied. He smiled at that. Maple looked up at him. Her tail moved once, slow and steady. Behind them, in the main building, someone was playing a guitar. Laughter drifted out through an open window. The late September light stretched long and warm across the grass. The cedar chest sat at home in Collingwood now, empty of everything but the quilts and the letters and the tin biscuit box. Frank had left it exactly as it had looked, before he lifted the false floor, except that he had cleaned the brass fittings and oiled the wood. It sat in the corner of his living room, and sometimes in the evenings he rested his hand on the lid when he walked past. He never needed to open it again. Everything it had held had already found its way into the world. Into these buildings, these programs, these mornings, when a veteran who had stopped expecting anything good might sit down in a chair and have a dog put its head in their lap without asking for anything in return. That, Frank Decker had come to understand, was the thing Elaine had actually given him. Not the money, not the victory in a courtroom, not the satisfaction of watching Derek walk out of a hearing without what he had come for. She had given him a purpose worth being quiet for, and Maple had found it first.